we were actually just talking about you before you got on. Just like we really appreciate, especially as an outsider, appreciate like you being so thorough with the pieces that you're developing, and just like the attention to detail. I would equate you to like a mixing engineer in a sense. You just people record, that's the content, but like when you actually get in there and you kind of see the pieces and you start asking questions, it's like, oh, okay, this is just gumbo. It's part of gumbo, and I'm putting the pieces together. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I truly appreciate the time and the opportunity, just to break bread with you, and just have some real, just transparent conversations that I feel like a lot of people, black, white, others are just afraid to have. Uh,
Right.
I just think with where Fire in Little Africa is going, it's evolving from just this project to a movement in a sense. And
Mhm.
I think with these fireside chats, it provides Fila an opportunity to bring in some dope people who are doing amazing things that sometimes gets unnoticed. Um, and I'm grateful that you are the first person that we're doing in regards to this fireside chat. So just kudos to you off top, for that for sure. My first question is really just to get everything going. So just tell me about your background, like where you're from, um, and just like what brought you to Tulsa of all places? Like 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 why Tulsa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm from Montgomery, Alabama, actually, and that's a city with its own pretty complex racial history and sort of contradictory racial history. So I kind of just grew up in that environment. You know what I mean? And so I think I sort of am attracted maybe to or just have an understanding of those kind of contradictions. Montgomery is the capital of the Confederacy and the birthplace of what people refer to as the modern civil rights movement. So that kind of gave me just a base level of some level of understanding, I think, about some of the contradictions that are present here in Tulsa. But I was interested in writing first and foremost. I used to write fiction, poetry. I thought I was going to be a movie screenwriter at one point. And so
Who are some of your inspirations?
sorry, what'd you say?
Who are some of your inspirations as far as writers and
Oh, my inspirations. I would say when I was like a kid, like in middle school and high school, probably honestly hip hop was a big inspiration, to be honest with you, just in terms of groups like Outkast, for example, 90s Nas. I remember being a kid, so I'm 31, so this is like mid 2000s. And I remember sort of there was like the Ja Rules, Nellies of the world or whatever I was into like middle school. And
yeah,
I got access to like my homeboy's older brother's like 90s archive, like the Biggie, the Illmatic,
yeah,
Minimal Doubt, all that stuff. And I was like, oh, this is what hip hop is. Whoa. So like
yeah,
um honestly just that, especially the like all the lyrical dexterity that you found in those albums and the storytelling ability, that was a huge impact for me. Specifically in that middle school to high school age when I sort of started thinking of myself as a writer. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was actually a huge impact for me. We read that in school, and I think I hadn't really like those two things accomplish in some ways they accomplish something similar where it's like, okay, being a good writer means you write in this like very formal, complex style, and you convey how smart you are by like how well you can put together sentences in a formal way. That's what you learn in school. And so I feel like that book in particular had a lot to say about race and the Jim Crow South and all this, but it's from the perspective of this 10-year-old redneck kid essentially. And just sort of seeing that how much complexity could be conveyed from that kind of perspective. I probably read that in like 8th grade, maybe 9th grade. And I just thought about writing as being like a something you had to do in a very formal way before that. So that was a huge impact for me. Um, and then after that, I got into journalism after graduating high school, essentially, and sort of saw that as a way to marry this interest in writing with sort of my interest in the world and curiosity about the world. So I started working for a local newspaper in Montgomery, like a local weekly, doing like human interest features, basically. And then I actually went to the University of Alabama. another place with a really complex racial history and contradictions everywhere and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I went to school there. I was actually the editor of the school paper at Alabama for 2 years. And after I was at Alabama, I went to New York City, and I was actually a business reporter at Time Magazine for a while, covering technology like Facebook, Apple, all those companies.
Cool.
But I actually still had an interest in writing about history and race and history and that stuff. So I was trying to find opportunities to write about that stuff. I covered the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma for Time Magazine, for example.
How did that feel?
Sorry, what?
How did that feel?
It was interesting. I had to put in a lot of legwork for them to even send me down there. Like one of my big challenges working in a place like that was they didn't really, or I didn't feel at the time that they really were that interested in what I wanted to do as a writer, how I wanted to grow, you know, because I was a business reporter. My job was to cover like Facebook earnings reports, essentially. So then I was like, well, I think I want to go cover this 50th anniversary in Bloody Sunday. I'm from Alabama, you know, I think I have a lot of connection to this story. But I had to actually go stay at my parents' house and like drive to Selma, which is about an hour from Montgomery. I drove every day for like 5 days to do because they didn't want to pay for a hotel. So, but I mean, the actual coverage of being there was actually really, it was easy for me. It was kind of similar, I felt, what I'm doing here in Tulsa, because I didn't actually write about President Obama being there or that kind of stuff. I actually wrote about the Black high school in Selma and sort of what those students had experienced and the history of that school and how it had once been integrated but had not resegregated, and sort of like what those on the ground dynamics were in Selma. So it's much more about that than it was about sort of like the pomp and circumstance of the celebration, you know?
Cool.
So, you know, that's kind of what I've been trying to do here in Tulsa as well, you know, kind of looking past the sort of commemoration, celebration, what you want to call it, to like what's actually going on the ground among the people who've been there for a long time.
So I want to go back to Alabama, because I was reading your article with the New Yorker, Living in the Age of the White Mob. You talk about particularly University of Alabama and University of Oklahoma, which is where I went to school.
Okay.
So just it's all a part of the process. So
Yeah.
and there's one piece that I want to highlight in there that I really want to flesh out. You said members of white mobs do not have to mask their faces. And this is in regards to the Capitol takeover that happened a few, probably a month and a half ago.
Yeah.
So members of white mobs do not have to mask their faces. They do not need the protection of a conspiracy of silence. Being part of a white mob has rarely been a crime. These tactics, when adopted, are done to instill fear and also for pleasure and excitement. The white mob gains power not from secrecy, but from its explicit endorsement within white society. Across the U.S., Tulsa Massacre dominated newspaper front pages. One local editorial declared the old nigger town must never be allowed in Tulsa again. Writers took pictures in front of burning buildings and collected postcards of the carnage. If Facebook Live and selfie sticks had existed, members of the white mob would have broadcasted destruction to the world in real time. So yeah, we just want to get into it. Like, what similarities or differences do you see from 1921 in comparison to what's happening in 2021? And that really resonated with me, just about, you know, the power of white supremacy, the audacity, and even just the boldness to even convey these particular elements. So just talk about that. One, as a Black man, but also as a writer who's trying to convey these messages to the world. What is your process as you're processing these things in a pandemic? But also, how does that connect to like this larger discussion around you coming to Tulsa and talking about the work, the commemoration outside of the commemoration, but just talk about those things in a sense.
Sure. I mean, I thought maybe the way into that idea is that I actually didn't want to come here and focus in particular on the massacre. You know, one of my thoughts was that, because there have been books written about the massacre and that kind of thing before. So one of my thoughts was that, oh, it'd be great to have a narrative that really centered Greenwood itself and the people who lived there over the course of generations. And so that's really, and I came to Tulsa in November 2019 and started working on the book about a year before that. So that I'm saying I kind of signed up before all of the attention started, I guess, before Donald Trump came and all these things happened. So it's been, I mean, interesting is the most neutral word. I would say disheartening, alarming, how central the massacre itself and that white supremacy leading to violence, how central that's become to the story of America, you know, in our modern time. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that was obviously gestating, you know, for the last several years, but it's become so much more pronounced in the last year or so, epitomized mostly by the Capitol riot. And so for me, it's been sort of surreal to have come here to do historical research. And just as my thought, I was going to do some historical research and talk to people today in modern Tulsa about how they relate to the past, but have the past sort of become present in a really active way, you know? Probably the most emotional. Also, I should say that for an article like that, I wasn't going to write that. Like, I don't observe events like the Capitol riot and then like immediately want to engage with that level of intensity, you know, because it's requires a certain level of, I mean, again, kind of going back to the way hip hop works, but a certain level of emotional intensity, but also control, you know, get that information out and the way I want to get it out. But I actually had a conversation with somebody at the Oklahoma Eagle. A lot of my book is focusing on Black media, history of Black media in Greenwood. And anyway, I had a conversation with somebody there about like how important it is to have someone, a Black person with that perspective, with that platform, sort of conveying what this really means, you know. Mm-hmm. Actually, when somebody over there told me, encouraged me to write the column, and then I was like, okay, let me actually focus on this and see what I have to say. And then I wrote that column about I think the Sunday after the riot, like in a few hours, basically. So yeah, it's been. But yeah, I was gonna say though that, well, as I was writing it, I was really struck by. I didn't really even intend to do it this way, but the structure of it and sort of the directness of it was pretty similar to A.J. Smitherman's writing in the Tulsa Star before the race massacre, where he's just sort of like laying out in very clear and direct terms. He's not really being that emotional about things. He's not really talking about, he's just laying out like, these are the facts. These are the laws we have. These are the laws we're supposed to be following. I need y'all to hear me right now. You know what I mean? And so I wasn't even thinking about doing that intentionally, but then when I sort of I cite him in the column. And so when I sort of like re-engaged with his actual writing, I realized how similar it was and how sad it was to me that I had read his stuff 2 or 3 years ago as a historical artifact. I literally wrote a very similar column dealing with things that are happening right now. So yeah, I would say overall it's a disheartening dynamic that I actually wasn't anticipating when I came here.
Right. So in addition to that, I use these in quotation outsider because you're not an outsider in my book anymore. But as someone who's not from Tulsa, what has struck you most about the state of, in particularly the Black community, but also the totality of like the Tulsa community as a whole? What are some things that you've just been amazed by? Are there any similarities that you see between Montgomery and Tulsa, or just the South as a whole? Yeah, just kind of talk about those particular elements, and in particular in regards to like history around Greenwood. What have been some misunderstood facts about the legacy of Greenwood? Because you're talking about it from the context of placing the agency back into the Black community and not focusing on the massacre, which I appreciate. So yeah, just talk about what are some things that you have seen since you've been here in Tulsa, and like what are some misconceptions around the legacies of Greenwood, that you really want people to know about.
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest things I've seen that I would say is a difference between Montgomery and Tulsa is the history here feels a lot more personal, I would say. Like I've just been very struck by both when I didn't know that much, and I would just sort of observe the way people carry themselves in city council meetings, for example, when they're talking about what's going to happen in Greenwood or what's going to happen involving police violence. Or there's just so much history bound. Everyone's individual story is so bound up in the history of Greenwood and Tulsa, and that was really striking to me. I thought maybe partially that's because the story was buried for so long. You know, it's obviously never been properly accounted for, either in a historical sense or in a monetary sense. And so I don't know. It feels very much like it is like Montgomery's story is kind of America's story. You know what I mean? And it's sort of always when I was a kid, I learned about it. It was like here are these world-shaping events that happen in your hometown, and there's sort of a level of distance there that I always felt about it. But then when I came here, it was like, well, no one's ever even laid out what happened here properly. So like no one, like it's still very much Tulsa's story in some ways, Tulsa's burden, you know, Greenwood's burden in some ways. So I bet that just struck me a lot. And then as I've learned more about and done more research, I'm like, wow, now I see, like that was intuitive, just talking to anybody almost. But now I've actually done the research and I see the family lines, and I understand all the efforts that have been made to get reparations or to redevelop Greenwood in the way that the Black community wants. And so all the dynamics that are on the surface make even more sense the more I learn about it.
You mentioned about reparations, like in your mind, do you feel like reparations or any type of racial reconciliation is a reality in Tulsa? And if so, why? If so, why? If not, like why not?
Well, are you asking it? Is it present today, or will it happen in the future?
Will it happen in the future?
Okay.
You believe that obviously the lawsuit with the Mario Solomon Stevens and the rest of the folks, like the things that they're fighting for, which me personally, I'm in support of. Do you think that's an actual possibility? And if so, what needs to happen for us to get that?
So I'm gonna start with just saying some stuff about what I've done research-wise. I would like to start with a basis in fact.
Sure.
So I wrote a big feature actually about.
Also want you to talk about like the process of conducting research on something like this. Like, I think a lot of people, oh, hey, I'm writing this book about X, Y, and Z, but like also talk about the process of like seeing the data and then being able to interpret it in a way that speaks not only to you, but speaks to back to the agency of the Black community. So talk about that as well.
Sure. I think the best way for me to talk about it is actually talk about a different place, Rosewood, Florida. Rosewood is a community that was destroyed by a white mob in 1923, under somewhat similar circumstances to Tulsa, involving a rape accusation. And that community was wiped off the map essentially. And anyway, in the 1990s, they actually got reparations for massacre or survivors of that racial violence. So when I was actually coming in to do this Tulsa story, I was very curious about like, how did that happen and what happened after that? You know what I mean? So last year for Time Magazine, actually, I wrote a big feature. I actually went to Florida and to the former site of Rosewood and talked to several families, including one family who got reparations. They got, oh man, what's the number? It's something like $150,000 per person who was a survivor. There are like 9 people left because this happened 7 years after the fact. But anyways, this woman had gotten the $150,000. She bought a house with it in near Jacksonville, Florida, and her family still lives there. Her grandson lives in the house now, and great grandchildren. So my story was sort of about, it really started with that family in 1923 and what happened to them on the night Rosewood was destroyed, and then went through what happened in the 90s, how the Black people in particular, the people who advocated for themselves and convinced the state legislature to award reparations, and also what happened after the fact. How did that money actually impact people's lives? I thought that was important because I think it's important to ground things in reality and strategy and all that stuff, that's very important to me and how I sort of think about the world. And so for me, there's often all this rhetoric about, well, how can we do reparations? How will we figure out who owed the money? And sort of, it's impossible, more or less, is one argument, but like, it's not impossible because they figured it out. And so that's where I kind of went through all the mechanics of it. You know what I mean? And so obviously Tulsa was in my mind when I wrote that, because I was like, oh, like, people here should read this, maybe a state legislator would be motivated to actually do what they did in Florida, because that was a state legislative action, you know what I mean? But in terms of actually like strategy, or sort of like how we get to the point of making it happen, I think a big part of it is offering up multiple arguments that different people can get on board with. So in Tulsa's and Greenwood example, I mean, there's a moral argument because the attack was motivated by white racism, and that was so omnipresent at the time. And Tulsa owes a debt, like a moral debt, to the community of Greenwood, and that gets a certain group of people engaged. But then there's also like a more like legal argument about, well, the Tulsa Police Department, they were obligated to protect their own citizens. They failed to do that. There's plenty of evidence when you look at National Guard records and firsthand accounts from white people in Tulsa talking about what happened on that night. There's plenty of evidence that, at the very least, the police failed in their duty. And the Rosewood case, actually, that's all they did, and that was enough to warrant reparations. They failed it wasn't even that there was a conspiracy to destroy Rosewood by the police or whatever. It was just that they failed in their duty to protect their own citizens and protect their property. And so, that's another argument also. And then there's the third level, which is sort of like the active conspiracy argument, or sort of like what role, how much premeditation was there, and then how does that impact what the city owes? So I'm saying there's all kind of different levels or stages that can be very persuasive arguments. And I think that, just bringing out the evidence, I think one good thing about, hopefully that will come out of this reparations lawsuit, is yielding more of this evidence, not just sort of what's out there now, but like there are like city council records and like urban renewal records and all these kind of documents that sort of show people's thinking and their motivations and their actions. You know what I mean? So I just think I've noticed it through my own research, there's just a lot that hasn't actually been detailed that closely. Like it's a lot of it's out there, but no one's really put it all together. And so I think as more of that information comes to light, then the argument, from my experience at least, as I've read more, the arguments become more persuasive, not less persuasive,
So for you as a writer, I would also argue as an activist, like you are constantly fighting to neglect the corner, like Black history present in the current consciousness. So like, how do you see your role, in particular, like this legacy of like A.J. Smith and then that you talked about too? How do you see the role of the writer, of the journalist, in the creation of a new Black future, in a sense? Like, how do you, and in particular, how do you see journalism working alongside, in tandem with like this developing hip hop scene that you're noticing here in Tulsa? Like, do you feel like your role is, like, with the thinking of like this, the Smitherman of the worlds? Like, what do you think your responsibility is to kind of keep that going?
That's something I struggle with a lot. I think partially because this has been a pretty new experience for me. So I guess I used to work for Time Magazine. I also work for a website called The Ringer. And when I was like a national reporter, so I would go to places sometimes for like 4 or 5 days and figure out what I could figure out and then write a story about it. I came to Tulsa in that context. I wrote a story about Tulsa in 2018 for The Ringer. I came here for like 4 or 5 days and met a few people and wrote what I could write. So it's been really, and I think partially it's because, that was my 9-to-5 job. So it's easier to sort of remove yourself from the situation, or even conceptually remove yourself. If it's like, oh, this is my job, they assigned me to do this, I'm gonna do my job and go home. I'm a freelancer now. So I basically own my own business, which is writing about Tulsa. I also live in Tulsa. And so when I write, whatever I write, I hear from people, in down the street.
Yeah.
I live on Denver Ave, so if I write, I wrote a story about the bookstore in my neighborhood on Fulton Street a while ago. So if Onika and I been happy about that story, I would have heard about it. You know what I mean? So that's been an interesting. That's actually brought me back, I think, in a lot of positive ways to community journalism, which I was involved with in college. And so it maybe reminded me how important that is and how much richer that type of journalism is compared to blogging or takes or even what people can now call parachute journalism, which is what I used to do, which is like I go to somebody for 5 days and figure out what I can figure out.
Yeah.
So I think that's been interesting for me. I think I'm still trying to figure out where I fit on the journalist, sort of commentary person, sort of activist scale. I haven't figured that out for myself yet. When you go to journalism school, you learn how important objectivity is. So that's my training. But then you sort of, obviously we've seen in the last few years, I mean, it's always been true, but it's been laid bare in the last few years how that can be manipulated by people in power.
Do you find yourself unlearning some of those concepts around objectivity?
I would say interrogating them more. I think I'm honestly like trying to figure it out, man. So I don't have the pithy statement about it, but there is a lot of value in hearing and trying to understand everyone's perspective on a situation and trying to absorb all that information. I think that's actually really important because you learn in journalism fast that you make a lot of assumptions that are not true. You know what I mean? And so you got to hear everybody's perspective. Now, how you decide to present that information to the world, I don't think you have to give every single perspective equal weight. You're deciding how to present things, or because every story is shaped by the writer. You know what I mean? And the stories that aren't shaped by the writer, especially today, it's hard to have an impact that way because people want to know what you think and expect to be able to understand that. You know what I mean? So I think I don't know. I really need to, I think when I finish this project, actually that's gonna be a good time for me to reflect a little bit on like where I've come, from where I started before I came to Tulsa. But I will say that objectivity is not the be all end all. And I think there should be more of that theory about the purpose of it and like the challenges to it should be taught to younger writers. They can sort of start grappling with it a little bit earlier than I have. You know what I mean?
You mentioned a couple of times about you and your work with the Ringer, and a lot of your work is centered on like technology and how it shapes contemporary culture, even urban policy. So, what role do technology plays in the betterment of Black communities, or how are they harming it? So, it's kind of talk about that, but also, what role do you think technology could play in the creation of a new Black Wall Street, both practically and philosophically?
Well, I mean, in terms of harm, one interesting thing for me as a tech reporter is I started in 2012 as a tech reporter, which was sort of like the peak of like tech is amazing. That's like post Arab Spring, and like I think Mark Zuckerberg had recently been the Time Magazine Person of the Year and all this stuff. And tech is just so great. And I was a huge tech fan. Like I remember the iPhone dropped when I was a senior in high school. I was so hyped about that. So I was like a big like tech geek kind of guy, basically. And it was sort of interesting watching that whole dynamic shift. Like I felt my own perspective when it changed as I became more exposed to those companies up close. And then also we saw the entire sort of culture shift and sort of turn against what they represent. And so for me, a lot of times what's important or became important was to look at sort of like how are they shaping not just the bits of the world, but the atoms of the world, how are they shaping our actual lived space? You know what I mean? Because I think one of the biggest challenges I was thinking a lot from a consumer perspective, because I'm just thinking about if I'm a regular person doing whatever, how am I actually going to impact the world? And so tech is so frictionless. It's almost too frictionless. You don't even think about the impacts you're having. If I go take an Airbnb in this gentrifying neighborhood, or if I order Seamless when there's an ice storm outside last week, you know, they make that really easy to do. That's probably a bad decision when you think about it, but it's just so easy to do that kind of stuff. So I started thinking a lot more about that, just about the frictionless the technology offers and how that can actually cause like unforeseen problems. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something that we might see change a little bit. There's efforts to like break up some of these huge tech companies right now. That's a type of friction. You know, these companies can't just effortlessly make trillions of dollars or whatever. Mm-hmm. But in terms of for Black communities, I think that, well, one thing that's interesting is because I'm actually hoping to do a story about this right now, but because of the killing of George Floyd and all the aftermath involving the racial reckoning, there's been a lot of, at least a lot of talk about investing in Black communities, and some things that have been, I think, surprisingly tangible. Netflix has actually invested in a Black-owned bank in Mississippi, $10 million. Not invested, but deposited. Let's just say that, it's important. They just put their money there, you know what I mean? So anyway, I just think so looking at sort of how these big companies, they made a lot of big commitments last summer to racial justice. And so I think sort of following up to see like what happens with those. That's something I'm really interested in doing while I'm working on this book project, and probably also afterwards.
Feel like it's genuine, coming from a genuine place?
I mean, there are people inside those companies who are genuine, I think. I would imagine that something like this Netflix investment, I haven't actually done the research yet, so I'm not positive on this, but I would imagine it's probably started by some Black employees at Netflix who say they're pushing them to make some kind of change. Cool. You know what I mean? Now, obviously for the company itself, it's all kind of a triangulation. And so I don't think those companies alone are not going to create the kind of change that needs to be created. But I think there's a level of accountability involved now, both from like a PR perspective and also from an internal perspective, that creates more pressure for them to do more. So I think it's part of the equation to have a Netflix or Apple or whatever these companies are engaging more in the Black communities. But I also think a big problem or challenge is the power they accrue. So I'm a big, I don't want to say proponent. I think it's worth exploring how much monopoly power those companies have, because if I'm a small business owner trying to launch a new digital business, it's really hard to compete with those firms. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I'd love to see, obviously, you know, in music, Spotify is taking over more and more of the way the music industry operates. You know what I mean? So I think that I think all that stuff needs to be explored a lot more to sort of figure out how we can make sure that there's opportunities for smaller businesses, which are often the ones that are actually Black owned, you know?
So in regards to this thread of like being genuine, the events that you may be aware of in regards to the centennial, the things that have been working behind the scenes, do you feel like majority of the events are genuine, or do you feel like people are just capitalizing off of, you know, this Black Death?
I think what I would say is, all right, something that struck me a lot. I just, you know, I don't have the sweeping statements. If I do, I gotta think about it a long time. I'm just that kind of guy. I'm gonna stay for a while, and then I'm gonna write something like that white mob piece after I've thought about this for a long time. But what I will say is, I went to the Greenwood Rising groundbreaking ceremony. That was in August, I believe. This museum they're building right on Greenwood Avenue. And there was a mixture of talk about the massacre and remembrance, and a massacre descendant spoke, and, you know, sort of the somberness and reverence that I think is appropriate. But also the director of the Oklahoma Tourism Department spoke. at that event. And either there or later, I've sort of heard talk about how they want this museum to be their version of like the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial in Montgomery. So I mean, I think there's multiple motivations happening at the same time. And so the question kind of becomes like, you know, which one's going to win out, or which one's going to actually shape the direction of these efforts, you know, these entities. And in the case of that, Greenwood Rising, I haven't actually talked to the people involved with that super closely, so I'm not going to, you know, make more comment than that on it. But that was something that happened that I observed. I just thought it was kind of interesting and not who I expected to be at that event. I'll say that, you know what I mean?
Sure. So yeah, let's just switch gears a little bit. So obviously this is Fireside Chat. And you know, we're gearing up for the release of Fire in Little Africa. And to my understanding, you were there, a part of the Bottom of the Map podcast.
Yeah.
During the recording of the project. You also at the recordings at all?
I didn't get to make it to those, but I was there for the press junket type situation.
So what was your overall impression just of that event, or just any other things that you experienced that during that weekend?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I really liked about the entire project is the communal aspect of it, you know. And then from what I've observed, at least, it seems like everybody's trying to help each other shine on it, that kind of thing. So I thought that definitely came through in the dynamics of that weekend. Just another example of that. Steph Simon, I've talked to several times, and I feel like we would have become homeboys in a non-COVID environment, but you know, I see him off and on this last year.
Yeah.
This was a little bit later, but I was talking to him. I did a story about Juneteenth, and I was out there for all the stuff happening for the Juneteenth concert. I wanted to interview him, and then he brought two of the other rappers from Fire in Africa to the interview. You know, he wanted to make sure they got some shine too. And so I just thought that was great, you know, that everyone in part of that project is trying to lift each other up and that kind of thing. A lot of my book is actually going to be about collectivism versus individualism and that tension that exists. I think always for Black people, but now kind of for America, right? America's got to figure out if it's going to take collective action or collapse in on itself, basically. So anyways, I think that Fire in Africa seems like to me that it really represents that collectivist mindset in a great way. So, you know, I'm actually curious about how the dynamics or how the rollout has been thrown off by what's, you know, happened in the world, and you know what the new plans are if they've changed, you know.
I think America is just a part of the rollout, to be honest. They're providing the content to be like, this is why we're doing this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, even the pandemic obviously like changed stuff, but like you mentioned like this communal aspect. I mean, it was hopping on some phone calls and you're like, okay, so yay or nay with this song. Like, so it kept going. So yeah. In addition to that, I want to kind of flesh out this field of stuff more. So we've talked about the Capitol riot. We talked about AJ Smith in this role. We talked about your work. You're from Alabama. I mean, to be specific, your experiences at the University of Alabama, New York, Tulsa. You know, the centennial is coming in almost 2 months. March, April, May. So 3 months. Um, what do you believe the impact people could have in regards to obviously the album, but even just like the other elements, components, the social commentary, the stories tell? What do you feel like could be the impact, not only for America, but specifically for like other Black Wall Street around the world? I know you mentioned Rosewood, even just like Ferguson, Oakland, Omaha, Nebraska. Montgomery, like, what do you feel like this project could mean for Black folks around the world? And not even get to the diaspora piece, but like, just kind of talk about like, what do you feel like this project could do in regards to healing for Black
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to that earlier idea about hip hop, right? Like it just connects. Um, it connects in both like a literary sense and a more visceral emotional sense. I think that's really special, and so that's just the way to connect with people that you're not going to reach with the books or the documentaries or sort of those other formats. Each one of those is going to connect with people in a different way. So I think that's powerful to have some space for that in Tulsa with this story. And I also think it's great to have a community that isn't like from the coasts or like, you know, one of the major metropolises of the United States or whatever. Just showing that there's creativity in all corners of our country. I think that's really important. It's something that people in New York don't think about a lot. A lot of them don't think about that. You know what I mean? I just live there. I just know how, especially of the media companies at least, how their mindset is. You know what I mean? And so I think that having just that evidence that you can, you know, put on from the middle of America, I think that's just so important, both for artists in other communities, just for people living in other communities, and because, you know, one thing I think is important. You just talked about these different other Black Wall Streets, but like the dynamics of Greenwood, I think earlier you asked about surprising things or things people need to, I would hope people understand more, is that the core dynamics that made Greenwood successful, a lot of them were happening in other parts of America at the same time, you know? So like Durham, North Carolina had a huge Black insurance company, and it was also kind of known as the Black Wall Street. Richmond, Virginia had the banker Maggie Walker, one of the first female millionaires in America. And all the communities actually were in contact with each other a lot. You know what I mean? A lot of the elite students would go to schools like Fisk or Howard and, you know, interact, including people from Tulsa. Right. So I think that sort of understanding that everything is interconnected in that way, you know, I think Fire in Little Africa can represent that. You know what I mean? And I think that's a dynamic that I think people get a little caught up in, the sort of the snow globe idea with Greenwood, you know, that it was just this like unblemished, untouched jewel. And then the massacre happened. But that's not true, because everyone there was having to interact with white supremacy on a daily basis. But also they were drawing power and networking and opportunity from other communities, even in Oklahoma, you know, all these all Black towns and all this stuff. So I think that sort of having that ability to both speak to what's going on here, but then connect with the broader world, that to me feels a lot like the Greenwood ethos. I think it's great that y'all are able to connect those dots.
Well, I appreciate you kind of talking about like the romanticization of like Greenwood, like, hey, they did deal with shit back then. And so I definitely want to commend you on touching on that. I know in your newsletter you talk a lot about you know, the Tulsa plan is a mass grave site. You know, the previous plans that have been stopped, just like through a combination of this BS, politics, secrecy. You just for the audience who may not be familiar with this mass grave site, just talk about that and just maybe anything that you in particular have learned since you've been here in Tulsa.
Sure. So I guess the biggest like ongoing quote unquote mystery about the massacre is the site of mass graves. There are many eyewitness accounts, both white and Black, talking about Black people being moved around on trucks, being dumped in the rivers, and right in the immediate aftermath of the massacre. And there are also eyewitness accounts from decades later of people seeing Black bodies in cemeteries in Tulsa and that kind of thing. So there's a very strong basis of evidence for mass graves. I say that's important to understand. And so it's sort of become this, like I said, this I think it's interesting because it's sort of like, depends on who you talk to, what it means. You know what I mean? I think there's a danger of thinking of it as a symbol of evidence that this really happened. That's not needed. We already know what happened, and we have lots of documentation that proves in pretty strong detail exactly what happened in Tulsa and Greenwood. So I think that's a risk of these sort of mystery, true crime framing of it, you know, and that's like the easiest framing of it to do because, you know, everyone wants to know where they are, you know, it's very human, it's a very, put on very base human emotions. But, you know, I think that what's most important about it, at least to me, are I'd say two things. An opportunity to honor the dead. So an opportunity to try to atone in some small way for what happened as a city government and give the community an opportunity to do that. So I think that's really important. And then also I think that it does provide, it provides a space for other conversations to happen, you know? Like when I'm at the mass grave, they have the mass graves. So I should just back up and explain a little more. There's been thought to be mass graves since the massacre occurred. In the 1990s, the city of Tulsa began an effort to uncover the mass graves. It was stopped abruptly, kind of based on this idea that they didn't actually have the rights to dig on a certain spot, but broadly because of politics, right? And then it was reignited about 2.5 years ago by current mayor Bynum with urging from people in the Black community, leaders in the Black community. Councilwoman Bessel Harper was a big advocate, and so was Reverend Robert Turner, who's the pastor of Vernon AME Church. So now, you know, they have these meetings, and they actually have a meeting tonight actually about the mass graves and what's gonna be going on next. But it's created this space for engaging with all of the history of the massacre, I feel like. Sort of putting pressure or reminding the city about what else is owed, you know. When I go to these, say like press conferences, or when they actually doing the digs, a lot of press conferences at Oak Lawn Cemetery where they're currently searching for graves, and I'll ask the mayor of these events like, when do you plan to pay reparations, or you know, do you think that Greenwood massacre survivors and descendants deserve reparations? And so then that re-enters the conversation on a national platform, you know, because then there'd be other reporters there from like New York Times or whoever. So I think in that sense is important too, because it's like opened up this space to re-engage with a lot of other elements of the massacre. I think at this point, the city of Tulsa's perspective is any other questions about what should happen should be done after the grave search is done. However, the grave search is probably going to take years to complete. And so really these convos are going to be happening concurrently. But the grave search, now that it's gone so far and it's gotten so complex, I think it's going to continue to offer an opportunity to recenter those convos in Tulsa after the centennial. I think that's actually really important.
In regards to those observations, those meetings, how would you rate? Not even rate. How serious do you think the city is about doing some real work in relation to the information, the data they're actually receiving? Or do you just feel like people are talking about it and nothing is really being done?
I think they're serious. I think they've assembled a lot of people like archaeologists and this kind of folks to engage with the work. It's an extremely complex task because there are a lot of laws involving unearthing these bodies and what you can do with them and getting approval from like private cemeteries and all this stuff. It's like really complex what they're trying to do. And they've obviously been thrown off by the pandemic. So, you know, overall, when I see those meetings, I do see a lot of people who are trying to get things done. I would also say though that I think what the city wants to do and what the community wants to do don't always align. You know what I mean? So I think the city is sincere about doing what their plan is, but not necessarily what everyone in the community wants the plan to be. And so there's a tension there. And I think there's been a lot of challenges finding that common ground. That's what I know. That's what I observe in the meetings. And so, okay, there's a public oversight committee for the mass grave search. But from what I've observed, they basically get the information when I get the information, which is at these monthly meetings. And so then they're kind of being asked to like approve things, but they haven't even had time to think about them very much. You know what I mean? So it's sort of like, well, if I was going to be in this committee, I'd want to be updated regularly, at least via email, and then have some time to think about it, or present what I want to say in an intelligent manner, or ask questions ahead of time. So a lot of those dynamics, it sort of seems like I think there is a sincere effort happening, but I think that incorporating and respecting public feedback, not even public feedback from Greenwood leaders, it feels like to me that could be handled in a different way, maybe a more productive way.
Okay. We can keep it. Just some more lighter questions. It could be lighter. So I mentioned the New York article, and you interviewed an individual who found out his grandfather was a part of the massacre. In the work that you're doing, have you found any folks who have blocked like the question that you asked in regards to like the clean information? Is there anything that you've asked that people like, I'm not talking about this, or I'm not going to answer this question? Like, talk about those things.
Well, I'll tell you first that one secret is all those questions are always for the end of the interview. And that means they're for the end of my time in Tulsa. You know what I mean? So like about the last 3 months of this whole process is when a lot of those questions get unloaded. So I would say that, in some sense, I think that hasn't been as much of an issue because I just go real slow with people. That's one thing I do. You know what I mean? So if I have tough questions to ask you, and I've had asked some people some tough questions. I don't know if I can get into details of their stuff right now, but if I'm going to ask you a tough question, not people that I had to talk to for like months, you know what I mean? And so we would be talking weekly for a long time. And then I would have a pretty personal question about, their family's history or something that maybe isn't always talked about in public, but because we've developed that rapport, they're willing to be open and honest with me about it. You know what I mean? So I think it's been more, I think again too, because a lot of what I'm doing is focused on centering Greenwood and the Black community. So it's less about, I'm going to go chase down these mob descendants or whatever. That kind of came to me by chance that I talked to that guy, to be honest. So I haven't spent that much time trying to do that. I'm sure if I did, like for example, that guy has family here in Tulsa who are much more conservative than him. I've met them, so that's all I'm going to say about it. But I have X amount of energy to expend on this project. I'm not going to expend it try to get in those confrontational scenarios with people that don't want to talk to me. You know what I mean? So a lot more of it for me is actually finding those or having those tough conversations with folks about their own family histories on the Black side, actually, and sort of getting them to feel comfortable enough with me to let me say the good and the bad,
In relation to that, like, obviously this is a very cliche question, but like, how important is history? Like, how important is it to like, hold on to? Like, what have you noticed, particularly when we talk to Black folks about their history? Like, what type of emotions or thoughts are you kind of, wrestling with in your mind as you're listening to these stories, particularly around Greenwood? Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel sad? Like, is it just emotions kind of all over the place? Like, what is that? What is that like?
I think one thing that's really struck me is the variety of experiences. Again, we talked earlier about sort of puncturing the mythology of Greenwood. I think that's important, actually. This is just an example, but I talked to one family so these people, there's like two women who are both like in their late 80s or about 90. So they grew up in like 40s Greenwood. And so one woman I talked to, her family owned like a lemonade parlor stand on Greenwood Avenue, and she would like work there as a high school teenager, like serving lemonade in the heart of Greenwood. That's like it's like Black Norman Rockwell. You know what I mean? Like truly, that is the Black Wall Street image. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Then another woman I talked to, her family wasn't as wealthy, and she worked as a janitor in the white movie theaters downtown, and she couldn't go to the theaters because they were segregated. And so that to me is very striking. And neither of them, neither of them are sort of talking about this with any kind of like pent up frustration or anger or whatever. I don't know. I feel like often when we talk to especially older people, I think partially it's because of just how much they've had to deal with and process. They often just don't talk about my parents like this. They don't talk about their history that way, and that they don't talk about their history the way I would write about the history. Do you know what I mean? So I've always found that to be interesting. But yeah, I think just the dynamics of the different experiences has been really striking. And then also, yeah, kind of like I think there's almost sort of like the sense that like it's really hard to put together the whole picture. Like you grew up in that scenario, and that's just a scenario you were in, and there wasn't like you couldn't just Google information about the big picture or like read a book about the big picture. That's just coming like today. You know what I mean? Like putting all the pieces together. And so I think that when you can see the whole big picture, it's a lot easier, I think, to be upset about it or passionate about it or that kind of thing. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I think that the level of I don't even know how to describe it. I just think that there's a different way that I, who didn't experience these things, convey it than the way that it's often conveyed to me. But I'm hoping that maybe I'm tapping into something deeper that they might have suppressed, I guess,
Okay, man, I wish I had another hour with you. But I'm gonna leave you with this question. Do you see anything in relation to the Black networks or community here in Tulsa that gives you hope for the future, for the next 100 years? Is there anything that you see? Obviously we've mentioned like Fulton Street books, and then shout out to all these people. But in regards to just Black networks or community here, is there anything that just gives you hope that like we're gonna be in a better place, down the road?
I would say a couple of things. I think it's been great to see places like Fulton Street and Silhouette paying folks rent and that kind of thing. They were like networking to do that in the midst of the pandemic recently. So I thought that stuff was awesome to see. You know what I mean? So I love that. I think this is it's kind of no one knows what's going to happen, but I think when I first came here and I saw Greenwood Avenue, was sort of surprised by how little was left and how there's like a luxury apartment here and whatever. Like it seemed as if, and my initial vision of my book was that, or expectation was that it might get subsumed while I was here. I might be writing about the end of it, kind of. You know what I mean? But I think you see things like the opening of some of these businesses like Silhouette. You see things like the Defense of the Black Lives Matter mural that happened on Greenwood Avenue. And even just like the party after Trump left and just how wild that was and how much excitement and energy there was in that moment. Like, I think actually that moment in particular could have a huge impact in the future. Just like having people have had that experience together in that space after all that.
On Juneteenth.
What you say?
During Juneteenth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I just think that there's been several moments like that where I've sort of experienced, or you sort of feel like you can feel the connection to the past in a really powerful way, and you understand why this community means so much to so many people. So I'm hoping that the attention, I think there's a lot of questions about, like, again, the mechanics of how the attention is going to impact people's lives in a tangible way. And I think that's tough to unravel, but I think I'm pretty confident that the attention is sort of planting a seed in a lot of different people about why this community matters and why it's important and why it needs to be preserved in a dignified way for Black people in particular. So I think that's going to continue no matter sort of what happens with the mechanics of what's going on in Greenwood.
Sure. Man, Victor, you are a gem. And I know I said it at the beginning, say it again. It takes a very special person to come into a city and to become acclimated and to not allow their ego to get in the way and truly roll up their sleeves and try to understand a community, a culture. And so, for myself, for Fire Little Africa, just Greenwood as a whole, we truly appreciate you. We hope you stay. That's a whole nother conversation too.
Right.
But
I gotta get some post-COVID time at least. I came in November 19th. That's like 4 months before everything went crazy. So
yeah, so
post-COVID
I
time.
expect it to go crazy once COVID does subside, God willing. But I just want to say, man, I appreciate you. I'm grateful that you are the first person that we interviewed for the Fireside Chat. Your wealth of knowledge, you're a living ancestor, and you truly are helping me to understand why education and history is so important. I think a lot of times, especially for me, being in school, like history was just something, in particular, history class was something I didn't enjoy. And I think it's important that, you from Alabama, going to the University of Alabama, you and getting these particular credentials, we have an honored responsibility to tell our stories. And again, I'm just grateful for your activism, your proactivity, and just truly grateful for just your aura and what you're doing for us. But in addition, what you're also doing for yourself. And so, yeah, again, Fire is grateful. We appreciate the time, and I hope this is not the last time that we get to speak. I think this is probably the only time we've had a conversation like this. I think we passed each other here and there, but definitely see who you are and what you're about, and definitely want to continue to build and outside of the book, but just truly grateful for that opportunity, for sure.
I appreciate it, bro. This was great. I'm hoping that this is of use to you somehow. What's the vision for this? I'm just curious.
So we have the podcast, which we've just been doing, like, the artists. There've been a couple episodes where it's been like people in the community, but we had a conversation recently, shout out to Chloe and Chris, about, where everybody's about the album in particular, but how do we crystallize, like, the totality of feeling. When you mentioned, like, there's an album, there's a book, there's a documentary, there's curriculum, like, we're really trying to meet people where they're at, to give them, like, the context of the project. I think for this Fireside, obviously, I have a PhD, and my dissertation was around these anti-Black experiences Black students face at these historically white institutions like Alabama and myself. And I'm a lot of students talk about, like, imposter syndrome. Like, I just feel like I'm not supposed to be there. And part of my role when I worked in college, like, education, was like, you realize who built these institutions, and for them to be able to connect, like, Black labor and, like, the student athletes of Black labor, and not being seen as a student, but just seen as an athlete. So I think the Fireside Chat allows us to have critical conversations about things people are afraid to talk about. People don't like talking about. But it's the Tulsa race match. How can you not talk about it? So it's just an opportunity to just have conversations like social commentary outside the album. Obviously, once the album's released, it'll be included, but it's for me to sit down and just have these just dope conversations with folks who are doing dynamic work that's connected to FEMA, but also how we're connected to your work as well. And that's really the beauty of it. We're just trying to show people that, like, even though this is a Black Wall Street album, it totally affects everyone. And how do we just have conversations where we're able just to listen to each other. Um, so even with the Fireside Chats, there may be people that I connect with, but it may be also some people that don't necessarily agree with the Fireside Africa. So how do we down and have those conversations respectfully? But,
Right.
so yeah, this is just a kind of like the behind the scenes, like philosophy behind Fever. It's not just an album, and I think a lot of people see it as that, or they
Right.
see it like we commodify like the story, the legacy, and it's like you have no idea the criticality that we're taking and like truly putting this all together. And I think it's very similar to what you talked about earlier about the case for reparations. Like it's just so overwhelming, so many different parts, so many people that are connected to it. So like, how do we wrap our minds around like even like figuring out what that looks like? So
Right.
I think we've done a really good job of like, have you seen Money Heist on Netflix?
Seen what?
Money Heist.
Mm-mm.
So it's basically like this series where these individuals are robbing like banks. In particular, I think like the World Mint in like in Spain, and but they're doing it like the government is is trash. So, but what I'm getting to when the government tries to go and infiltrate like the bank, people have already they know their moves before they come in, and I think
Right.
that's the approach that we're taking. We really sat down and said, okay, these are the components. Who does it affect? How do we connect those people together? And so, as when you talked about like the rollout, like the Capitol, for example, Trump coming to Juneteenth. Like Juneteenth was not a thing until he actually came. Shout out to Dr. Tiffany Purchase. But like these are the things that I'm seeing. Just building like you're doing exactly what we thought was going to happen. And so
Mm-hmm. Mm.
yeah, this is really just what this is with Fireside. Just for us to put our hair down.
Yeah.
Like for the Bob Dylan Woody Guthrie Center, I'm going to be me, and I want to have those conversations with folks who are doing dynamic work. So that's really all.
Gotcha.
Hope
Gotcha.
you be able to see it, hear it, and feel like the direction that we're trying to take with the project.